Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we'll explore a story that unfolded in the quiet neighborhoods of Rockford, Illinois, where autumn leaves once fell gently on tree-lined streets, and where a community came together in search of one of their own. This is the story of Katrina Smith, a 30-year-old woman whose life was cut short in October of 2012. As you listen, let your mind settle. Let the details wash over you like a gentle stream. This is a story of deception, of hidden truths, and ultimately of justice finding its way through the darkness. Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. Katrina Ashley Edlin was born on July 16, 1982, in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, on a warm summer day when the world seemed full of possibility. She grew up to be the kind of person people naturally gravitated toward, warm, hardworking, and determined to build a good life for herself. After graduating from Harlem High School in the year 2000, Katrina attended Rock Valley College, carving out a path in human resources. She found her calling at Cameron Industries in Belvedere, where she worked diligently, always professional, always striving to improve herself. Those who knew her described someone with ambition, someone who cared deeply about doing things right. In her personal life, Katrina had found what she thought was love. She married a man named Todd Smith, an insurance and investment broker who presented himself as successful, stable, and devoted. Together they lived in Mechasney Park, a peaceful suburb where neighbors knew each other's names and life moved at a steady, unhurried pace. Todd had 3 daughters from his previous marriage to a woman named Teresa. Katrina embraced her role as stepmother, and from the outside the blended family seemed to be making it work. 7 years into their marriage, in October of 2012, they returned from a trip to Washington State, where they had celebrated their wedding anniversary. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary life, something had begun to fracture. October 22nd, 2012, was a Monday. The autumn air in Illinois carried that particular crispness that signals the change of seasons. Katrina had been preparing for something important, a job interview scheduled for the following morning. She was up for a promotion, a recognition of her years of dedicated work, and she was excited about the opportunity. That evening, according to what would later be told to police, Katrina spent time at the home she once shared with Todd on Tedder Hall Lane. She did some laundry, finished preparing for her interview, and went about the quiet domestic routines of an ordinary evening. But Katrina didn't live at that house anymore. 2 weeks earlier, she had moved out. She was staying at a friend's condominium in Roscoe, a detail that would become significant as the investigation unfolded. That night, Todd claimed he saw her leave to go back to the condo. He sent her a text message. No response came. When October 23rd arrived, Katrina didn't show up for her interview. Her colleagues at Cameron Industries waited, confused and concerned. This wasn't like Katrina. She was reliable, punctual, the kind of person who wouldn't miss something this important without explanation. By afternoon, Todd Smith called the police. His wife, he said, had left their home the previous evening to go shopping and never returned. He appeared distraught, worried, the image of a concerned husband whose wife had inexplicably vanished. The Winnebago County Sheriff's Office began their investigation. They started with the basics, checking Katrina's last known movements, speaking with family and friends, trying to piece together where she might have gone. And then they found her car. On October 23rd, just 1 day after Katrina was reported missing, her blue Chevrolet Cruze was discovered. It sat abandoned near the intersection of Obispo Road and Ventura Boulevard in Mechasney Park, roughly 2 miles from the home she once shared with Todd. The car appeared to have been cleaned, wiped down carefully, but investigators know that traces of truth are difficult to erase completely. When they applied luminol, a chemical that reveals blood even after cleaning attempts, the interior of the car began to glow with a telltale blue light. Blood was found in the trunk. Blood was on the steering wheel. Blood was on the driver's seat. DNA testing confirmed what they feared. The blood belonged to Katrina Smith. Over the next few days, more pieces of evidence emerged, like breadcrumbs leading back to a terrible truth. Approximately 150 yards from where the car was found, searchers discovered Katrina's purse. The next day, her cell phone turned up in a bush by the side of the road. Then came the most chilling discovery: blood-soaked paper towels found in a field just south of where her car had been abandoned. Each piece of evidence painted a picture, but the picture was incomplete. They had Katrina's car. They had her belongings. They had blood. But they didn't have Katrina. Meanwhile, Todd Smith stood before television cameras, his face etched with what appeared to be anguish. He organized search parties. He made emotional pleas for his wife's safe return. The community of Rockford rallied around him, joining the search, distributing flyers, doing everything they could to bring Katrina home. Hundreds of people combed through fields and parks, along riverbanks and through wooded areas. They searched for days. They searched for weeks, but Katrina remained missing. November 9th, 2012. 17 days had passed since Katrina Smith was last seen alive. An off-duty firefighter was fishing along the Rock River near Byron, Illinois, about 25 miles from where Katrina had disappeared. There, caught against a log in the water, was a woman's body. The currents of the Rock River are strong, especially after heavy rains. The body had traveled downstream, clearing the Fordham Dam in downtown Rockford, moving nearly 30 miles before finally coming to rest in that quiet spot where the firefighter made his grim discovery. The Ogle County Sheriff's Department recovered the body and transported it to the coroner's office. On November 10th, an autopsy was performed. Detectives from both Ogle County and Winnebago County attended, knowing this might be the breakthrough their investigation desperately needed. Dental records provided the confirmation. The body was Katrina Smith. The autopsy revealed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The coroner's examination showed she had been struck 24 times across her head and body. At least 7 of those blows had been directed at her skull. Brutal impacts that spoke of rage, of determination, of intent to kill. What had been a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation. As detectives from the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office deepened their investigation, they began to uncover layers of deception that would have been almost impossible to believe if they hadn't been documented in official records. John Berg, the lead detective on the case, later reflected on how unusual this investigation was. He had never encountered someone who could stand before cameras, organize search parties, and appeal to the community for help, all while investigators believed, knowing exactly where the victim was because he had put her there himself. The investigation into Todd Smith's background revealed a man who had carefully constructed a public persona that bore little resemblance to reality. Todd Smith wasn't always Todd Smith. He was born Todd Rapperger. In 1985, when he was just 17 years old, he admitted to disconnecting a gas line in the home where he lived with his mother, stepfather, and 3 half-siblings. The home exploded into flames with his family inside. Miraculously, everyone escaped without injury. Todd confessed to investigators that he had not been getting along with his mother and wanted to scare her. He pleaded guilty to arson, was sentenced to 30 months of probation and 160 hours of community service. It was after this incident that he eventually changed his name, leaving Todd Rappreger behind and becoming Todd Smith. Years later, Todd married a woman named Teresa in Jamaica. They had 3 daughters together, but Teresa later described a marriage marked by control and difficulty. She said Todd struggled to provide financially for his young family, that she bore the burden of supporting them. The marriage ended in divorce. By the time Todd married Katrina, he presented himself as a successful insurance and investment broker, a family man who had his life together. The community saw him as upstanding, reliable, prosperous. But simultaneous with the murder investigation, federal authorities were investigating Todd Smith for mail and wire fraud. He was accused of helping to run a Ponzi scheme that defrauded elderly clients of nearly $1 million between 2009 and 2012. The financial success he displayed was investigators suspected built on sand or worse on fraud. The perfect life Todd Smith presented to the world was a carefully maintained illusion. As investigators dug deeper into Katrina's life in the weeks before her death, they discovered she had secrets of her own. The marriage that Todd described as extremely happy in his television interviews was actually falling apart. Katrina had been having an affair with a coworker named Guy Gabriel. She had moved out of the home she shared with Todd 2 weeks before she disappeared. She had consulted with a divorce attorney. She was planning to end the marriage, and Todd knew about all of it. On October 30th, 8 days after Katrina disappeared, detectives executed a search warrant at Todd Smith's house. They seized his laptop computer and a baseball bat from the garage. The bat appeared to have blood on it. What they found on Todd's computer was deeply disturbing. There was a folder related to explicit flyers that someone had created about Katrina's affair and distributed at her workplace, publicly humiliating her. There was a folder labeled Super Track Stick. A Super Track Stick is a GPS tracking device used to monitor the movement of vehicles. Investigators discovered that for months before Katrina's death, Todd had been secretly tracking her car. He knew where she went. He knew when she went there. He had been watching her, following her movements, stalking her. When police processed Katrina's abandoned car, they found a small clip on the underside with a disconnected wire, evidence that a GPS tracker had been attached. Co-workers at Cameron Industries told police that 2 weeks before Katrina disappeared, someone in disguise had driven to the workplace parking lot and distributed flyers containing explicit content about her affair with Guy Gabriel. The flyers were designed to shame and humiliate her publicly. Police found evidence on Todd's computer linking him to those flyers. Guy Gabriel, Katrina's lover, was investigated but had a solid alibi for the night of October 22nd. Despite the defense team's later attempts to implicate him, he was never seriously considered a suspect. The picture investigators assembled was of a man who had lost control of his carefully constructed life. His marriage was ending. His wife had moved out. His financial frauds were under investigation, and in his mind perhaps, Katrina held the key to maintaining his facade. She was the one with the steady job, the reliable income. Based on the evidence gathered over months of investigation, prosecutors pieced together what they believed happened on that Monday evening in October. Katrina did go to the house on Tedder Hall Lane that night. She went there to do laundry, taking advantage of the facilities at a home that was legally still partly hers. More importantly, she went there to have a conversation with Todd. She was going to tell him clearly and definitively that she wanted a divorce. Prosecutors believe the conversation escalated. Perhaps Todd tried to convince her to stay. Perhaps he pleaded or threatened or bargained. But Katrina was resolute. The marriage was over. At some point, Todd Smith picked up a Louisville Slugger aluminum baseball bat, and then he attacked his wife. 24 times he struck her. 24 blows rained down on Katrina's body. At least 7 times he hit her head, fracturing her skull, inflicting wounds that would prove fatal. After killing Katrina, Todd placed her body in the trunk of her own car. He drove the car to the area near Ventura Boulevard and Obispo Road, about 2 miles away. He stopped near the Rock River. There, in the darkness, he removed Katrina's body from the trunk and pushed it into the water. Then he began the walk home. Security cameras in the neighborhood captured a figure walking through yards in the late hours of October 22nd. One camera at a home on Norman Avenue showed someone passing through at 11:31 p.m. The homeowner later testified that the intersection of Ventura and Obispo was approximately a mile northwest of his property. Another camera on Elm Street captured similar footage of a person walking alone through the darkness. Todd walked back to the house he had shared with Katrina. He cleaned the scene. He disposed of evidence, the bloody paper towels that would later be found in a field. He cleaned Katrina's car as best he could before leaving it to be discovered. And then the next morning, he called the police to report his wife missing. On November 21st, 2012, the crime lab notified detectives that traces of Katrina's DNA had been found on the aluminum baseball bat seized from Todd's garage. On December 13th, Todd Smith was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of concealing a homicide. He pleaded not guilty. It would be more than 4 years before the case went to trial. During that time, Todd remained in custody, and the legal maneuvering was extensive. The defense argued that evidence should be suppressed, that searches had been conducted improperly, that the trial should be moved out of Winnebago County because the extensive media coverage had made it impossible for Todd to receive a fair trial. Each argument was considered and ultimately rejected. Detectives conducted multiple forensic examinations of Todd's computer, finding not only evidence of the GPS tracking but also cell phone records and tower data that placed Todd in the area where Katrina's car was found at the time. Investigators believed the murder occurred. The investigation revealed thousands of data points. GPS coordinates from the tracking device showed Todd following Katrina to work, monitoring her movements, keeping tabs on her affair. Cell tower records showed his phone connecting to towers near Ventura and Obispo late on the night of October 22nd. Surveillance footage showed someone walking through neighborhoods at the exact time someone would have been returning from disposing of a car near the river. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a case that seemed impossible to refute. The trial of Todd Smith began in January of 2017, more than 4 years after Katrina's death. The proceedings lasted 10 days. The prosecution, led by Marilyn Height Ross, the chief of the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Criminal Bureau, presented their case methodically. They showed the jury the GPS tracking evidence, proving Todd had been monitoring his wife for months. They presented the flyers found on his computer, demonstrating his knowledge of Katrina's affair and his willingness to publicly humiliate her. They showed the surveillance footage of someone walking through neighborhoods late on October 22nd. They presented the baseball bat with Katrina's blood on it. They showed the jury photographs of Katrina's abandoned car, the luminol test revealing blood throughout the interior. They walked the jury through the autopsy findings. 24 blows, 7 to the head, death by blunt force trauma. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt. They suggested Guy Gabriel, Katrina's lover, might have been involved. They argued that the computer searches were flawed, that evidence should be excluded. They questioned the reliability of GPS coordinates and cell tower data. But the evidence was overwhelming. Paige Smith, Todd's eldest daughter from his first marriage, attended the trial. She wanted to hear all the evidence for herself. She had once believed in her father, but as detail after detail emerged in that courtroom, the truth became inescapable. On January 25th, 2017, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty on all related charges. Todd Smith showed no visible reaction. He had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, and he would continue to do so. On April 4th, 2017, Judge Fernando Engelsma sentenced Todd Smith to 59 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, Todd continued to proclaim he hadn't killed his wife, that the justice system had failed, that he was the victim of a flawed investigation. After the verdict, Paige called her father on the phone. She asked him to tell her what happened. She wanted to hear the truth from him directly, but Todd refused. He was already planning his appeal, already looking for ways to overturn the conviction. When Paige pressed him, told him that even if he appealed he wouldn't win, he still wouldn't tell her what happened that night. That was the last time Paige spoke to her father. Todd Smith has made multiple attempts to overturn his conviction. He has filed appeals arguing that the trial should have been moved, that evidence was improperly admitted, that he didn't receive fair representation. Each appeal has been denied. The federal fraud charges that had been brought against Todd in 2014, the allegations that he helped defraud elderly clients of nearly $1 million were eventually dismissed without prejudice, the government choosing to focus on the murder conviction instead. Todd Smith is currently incarcerated in Illinois. He will be eligible for parole in the year 2069, when he will be over 100 years old. For all practical purposes, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Katrina Ashley Edlin Smith was 30 years old when her life was taken from her. She left behind her mother, Vicky Nalivak, her father, Bruce Edlund, her sister, Mirinda Castro, her brother, Chad Kaltfed, her grandmother, Dolores DeVenti, and countless aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, and close friends. Her memorial service was held at Heartland Community Church in Rockford. Hundreds of people attended to remember a woman who had been taken from them far too soon. She was buried at Arlington Memorial Park in Rockford, a place where those who loved her can visit and remember. In the years since her death, Katrina's story has been featured on Investigation Discovery's The Perfect Suspect and ABC's 2020, programs that examined the case and brought attention to the investigation that brought her killer to justice. John Berg, the lead detective who spent months piecing together what happened to Katrina, reflected on the case years later. He said it was one of the most complex investigations of his career, full of twists and turns. But more than that, he said the case would stay with him forever. Not because of its complexity, but because of the victim at its center. A woman who deserved to live, to achieve her promotion, to build a new life for herself. A woman whose life was stolen by someone who claimed to love her. And so we come to the end of Katrina's story. A story that began in a quiet Illinois suburb, where autumn leaves fell on peaceful streets. A story that unfolded through investigation and evidence, through the determination of detectives who refused to let a killer's deception stand unchallenged. In true crime, we often seek understanding. How could this happen? How could someone maintain such a perfect facade while harboring such darkness? The answers are complex and never entirely satisfying. But in Katrina's case, justice was served. The truth was uncovered, and the man who took her life will spend his remaining years in prison. His carefully constructed illusions finally and permanently shattered. As you drift towards sleep, let this story settle into the quiet corners of your mind. Remember Katrina not for how she died, but for how she lived. As someone who worked hard, who cared for her family, who was building toward a better future. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight's story is one of tragedy, but told gently, with a pace meant to carry you peacefully towards sleep. This is the story of Jonathan Emerald, a young man whose life was taken far too soon, in the early autumn of 2020, among the quiet forests of New Hampshire. Sometimes the most peaceful places hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes the kindest souls encounter the cruelest fates. Jonathan Emerald was born on January 27, 1995, in the small mountain town of Rangeley, Maine. When he was just 5 years old, his family moved to Milford, New Hampshire, a town of about 15,000 people nestled in the southern part of the state. It was here, in Milford, that Jonathan would grow up, finding his passions and building the foundation of the person he would become. From an early age, Jonathan was driven, not in a loud or boastful way, but with a quiet determination that impressed everyone who knew him. In high school, he became captain of not one, but 3 teams. Indoor track, outdoor track, and cross country. Picture him there running through the New Hampshire woods, his feet striking the earth in steady rhythm, mile after mile, always pushing himself to be better. But Jonathan's dedication extended far beyond athletics. He discovered the Souhegan Valley Boys and Girls Club when he was young, and it became a second home to him. As soon as he finished his runs after school, he would head straight to the club to volunteer. He gave so much of his time, so much of himself, that he logged over 700 hours of service. In 2010, when he was just 15 years old, Jonathan was named Youth Volunteer of the Year. He didn't even know such an award existed. The recognition didn't stop there. His dedication earned him 2 Presidential White House Youth Service Awards. One from President Bush and another from President Obama. For a teenager from a small New Hampshire town, these were extraordinary achievements. His volunteer work caught the attention of a recruiter from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Jonathan was accepted with a scholarship. In 2018, he graduated cum laude with a Bachelor of Science degree in biomedical engineering. He was 23 years old and the world seemed wide open before him. Jonathan quickly found work at Teleflex, a biomedical device manufacturing company in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, working as a manufacturing engineer. His colleagues would later describe him as someone who wouldn't hurt a fly, someone happy and talented, and always encouraging others to improve. He had a way of pushing people outside their comfort zones, always saying, "You did great. Now this is how we improve it, and do even more next time." But work wasn't Jonathan's only passion. He was an avid hiker, deeply in love with the mountains of northern New England. He set himself a challenge to summit all 67 mountains in the region that stand over 4,000 feet tall. By September of 2020, he had climbed 66 of them. Just one mountain remained. Jonathan had recently bought his own house in Keene, New Hampshire. At 25 years old, he was building a life, building a future. He shared his hiking adventures on social media, offering advice and stories to the outdoor community. He had so many friends who admired him, who looked up to him, who called him their brother. One of those friends called him his best man. Another friend would say Jonathan was the person you could count on to pick up the phone, whether it was a 3 a.m. work call to fix a problem, or a weekend spent planning the next hiking adventure. Jonathan was reliable. Jonathan was kind. Jonathan was good. And that perhaps was his greatest tragedy, because in September of 2020, Jonathan's kindness would lead him into the darkest night of his life. In that same small corner of New Hampshire, there lived a married couple, Armando and Brittany Barron. They had married young teenagers, really, and together they had 3 daughters. From the outside, they might have looked like any other family in Jaffrey, a town of about 5,000 people just a few miles from where Jonathan worked. But behind closed doors, their marriage was troubled. Brittany would later testify that she had been living in fear for years, trapped in a relationship marked by control and violence. She wanted out. She wanted a divorce, but she was afraid of what her husband might do. Brittany worked at Teleflex, the same biomedical company where Jonathan worked. She was a machine operator, and in the late summer of 2020, she and Jonathan were assigned to work on the same project. They spent time together during those days, talking during breaks, getting to know each other. Jonathan was kind to her. He was funny and sweet and encouraging. They began texting, messaging each other on Snapchat, sharing conversations that grew warmer with each passing day. Brittany told Jonathan that she wanted a divorce from her husband. She told him she wasn't looking for a relationship right away, but that she was willing to be friends, to get to know him better. They met at a park one afternoon after work and talked. Before she left, she gave him a quick kiss. It was brief, innocent perhaps, but meaningful. The next day, during a work break, they kissed again. This was just one day before everything would change. Brittany was careful. She would log out of her phone, trying to hide her messages from Armando. "I didn't want Armando to see that I was talking to a guy," she would later testify. But no matter how careful she was, it wasn't enough. On the night of September 19th, 2020, about a week after Brittany had told Armando she wanted a divorce, he went through her phone. He found the messages between her and Jonathan. He found the conversations, the warmth, the connection, and something inside him snapped. What happened next, in the early morning hours between September 19th and September 20th, would be described by prosecutors as brutal, horrific, and completely senseless. But for now, let's take this slowly, gently, as we move through the darkness of that night. When Armando discovered the messages, he became enraged. He grabbed Brittany and began to beat her. He choked her until she lost consciousness. When she came to, she thought she was going to die. He punched her repeatedly in the face, breaking her nose. He took a gun and shoved it into her mouth with such force that he chipped one of her teeth. "You know that you're going to die tonight, right?" he told her. He made her read the messages aloud, every single one. After each message, he would hit her again. He told her, "Don't do anything stupid, or the girls are going to walk into something gruesome." He sent their 3 young daughters next door to their grandmother's house. Then he forced Brittany into their Jeep Patriot. Armando took Brittany's phone and began to type. He pretended to be her, sending messages to Jonathan. "Can you meet me?" the messages said. He lured Jonathan to a neat wayside park, a small peaceful park in Renge, New Hampshire, part of a larger state forest that covered nearly 1,500 acres. And that wayside park was beautiful in the daytime. A quiet spot for picnicking with a quarter-mile hiking trail leading to the edge of Black Reservoir. But at night, especially in late September, it was isolated and dark. The gates were open, but the park was unstaffed. No one would be there to help, no one would hear anything. Jonathan arrived at the park, thinking he was meeting Brittany. Perhaps he was concerned about her. Perhaps he wanted to make sure she was safe. Instead, he found both Brittany and Armando waiting for him. What happened next was a nightmare. Armando attacked Jonathan immediately. He beat him with his fists and kicked him repeatedly. Jonathan, who had spent years running and hiking, who was strong and fit, tried to defend himself. But Armando was relentless, driven by a jealous rage that consumed all reason. The medical examiner would later testify that Jonathan had defensive wounds on his arms and hands, evidence that he tried to protect himself. There were bruises on his forehead and cheek in a zigzag pattern that looked very much like footwear impressions. Armando had stomped on him. Armando forced Brittany to participate. He ordered her to stand on Jonathan's neck. He told her to cut Jonathan's wrists. Terrified, knowing that her own life hung in the balance, she complied, though she would later say she didn't apply pressure to his neck as Armando demanded. Then Armando pulled out a gun. He placed it in Brittany's hand and ordered her to shoot Jonathan. She refused. She could not do it, even under threat of death. Even with everything she had already endured that night, she could not take Jonathan's life. She lowered the gun. She said no. Armando forced Jonathan into the back seat of Jonathan's own car, a Subaru. He ordered Brittany to get into the driver's seat. For a moment, Armando stepped away, leaving them alone. Brittany would later testify that Jonathan begged for his life during those minutes. He pleaded. He was afraid. Then Armando got into the back seat with Jonathan. Brittany heard him move. She heard him turn. And then she heard 3 gunshots. 3 times Armando fired his gun, twice into Jonathan's chest, once into his head. Jonathan Amarillo, 25 years old, was dead. In the darkness of that September night, with Jonathan's body still in the back seat, Armando gave Brittany her orders. She was to drive Jonathan's car north. He would follow behind her in their Jeep. She was to drive for hours, all the way to a remote campsite in Coos County in the far northern reaches of New Hampshire. 200 miles away, Brittany drove through the night. Armando stayed on the phone with her almost the entire time, talking to her, watching her, making sure she didn't try to run or call for help. She drove through small towns and long stretches of forest, Jonathan's body behind her, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her with every mile. They arrived at a campsite in an unincorporated area, called Atkinson and Gilmanton Academy Grant, deep in the woods of Coos County. It was remote, isolated, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. It was where Armando intended to dispose of Jonathan's body in a way that would make identification difficult. He forced Brittany to do unspeakable things. He told her they needed to remove Jonathan's head so there would be no dental records. No easy way for authorities to identify the body. He gave her a saw that had been left at the campsite. She used the saw and a smaller blade to complete the horrific task. She wrapped Jonathan's head and buried it. She wrapped his body in a tarp and covered it with branches. Armando went to buy a shovel from a nearby store and groceries from the IGA in Colebrook. Then he left Brittany alone at the campsite, telling her to finish disposing of the body. He drove home. Brittany stayed there, alone in the woods, with what remained of Jonathan. She stayed with him for days. On Monday, September 21st, Jonathan didn't show up for work at Teleflex. His colleagues were worried. This wasn't like him. Jonathan was reliable, always there, always on time. His mother reported him missing to the police. Investigators began looking into Jonathan's disappearance. They learned that Brittany Barron, who also worked at Teleflex, had called in that day to say she was quitting. They learned that coworkers believed Jonathan and Brittany had been involved in some kind of relationship. They traced Jonathan's phone records and found calls to Brittany's residence and to Teleflex. The search widened. Friends drove around looking for any sign of him. They walked through woods, hoping to find some clue. David Dupree Wilson, one of Jonathan's closest friends, kept everyone updated on social media as they searched desperately for their missing friend. Then, on Tuesday, September 22nd, Fish and Game officers were investigating a report of someone camping illegally in the remote northern woods of Coos County. They heard a dog barking. As they approached the campsite, they found Brittany Barron trying to quiet the animal. She had a pistol in a pouch on her midsection. The officers also found a large brown tarp covered with branches. When they moved the branches, they discovered it was covering a portion of Jonathan Emerald's body. On Wednesday, September 23rd, an autopsy was conducted. The chief medical examiner determined that Jonathan had died from gunshot wounds to the head, and the manner of death was homicide. On Thursday, September 24th, Brittany Barron was arrested and charged with 3 counts of falsifying physical evidence. On Friday, September 25th, Armando Barron was arrested and charged with capital murder for knowingly causing the death of Jonathan Emerald by shooting him while engaged in the commission of a kidnapping. The trial didn't take place until May of 2022, nearly 2 years after Jonathan's death. By then, Brittany had accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to 3 counts of falsifying evidence. She was sentenced to time served and released on parole in April of 2022. She agreed to testify against her husband. In the courtroom in Keene, New Hampshire, Brittany took the stand and recounted the horror of that night. She described the beatings, the gun in her mouth, the threats to her life and the lives of her daughters. She described how Armando had used her phone to lure Jonathan to the park, how he had beaten Jonathan mercilessly, how he had forced her to participate in the torture. She told the jury that she had refused to shoot Jonathan, even when Armando placed the gun in her hand. She described hearing the 3 gunshots as Armando killed Jonathan in the back seat of his own car. She described the long drive north, the phone calls throughout the night, the horror of what she was forced to do at the campsite. Armando's defense attorneys tried to suggest that Brittany was the real killer, that she was capable of lying and that her testimony should not be trusted. But the evidence told a different story. The medical examiner testified about Jonathan's injuries, the defensive wounds, the footwear impressions, the gunshots. Prosecutors presented evidence that Armando had all the motive in the world to kill Jonathan. The defendant had all the motive to kill Jonathan. Prosecutor Benjamin Igati told the jury, because for him, Jonathan was a man who had just started seeing his wife. On Thursday, May 26, 2022, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned their verdict. Armando Barron was found guilty on all 13 charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, criminal solicitation of murder, assault, domestic violence, and reckless conduct. Jonathan's mother was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She began to cry. The next day, Armando Barron was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 45 years on the other charges. Judge Elizabeth Leonard addressed him directly at the sentencing hearing. The depravity of your actions in single-handedly causing the pain and suffering and death of Jonathan Emerald show an extreme indifference to the value of human life, she said. Your actions were brutal. They were absolutely horrific. They were selfish, and they were completely senseless. Jonathan's family spoke at the sentencing hearing, their grief raw and overwhelming. His mother, Justine, could barely look at Armando Barron. She told the court that the last hours of Jonathan's beautiful life were spent in the company of what she called an ugly, hideous, demented creature. Jonathan's father, Kenny Emerald, called Armando a coward. You had to ambush and attack John with knives, a machete and guns just to take him down, he said. A wife beater. Disgusting. Despicable. The loss of Jonathan rippled through the entire community. His co-workers at Teleflex were devastated. One of them wrote in a victim impact statement that they had worked closely with Jonathan for about 2 years, that he was one of the best people they had ever known, that they had looked up to him and admired how accomplished he was at such a young age. He was such a happy-go-lucky guy who wouldn't hurt a fly, the co-worker wrote. When I saw he went missing, my heart sunk, and he was the only thing on my mind. Another friend wrote about how Jonathan was always there, always reliable, whether it was a 3 a.m. work call or a weekend hiking adventure. If you had John as a friend, you always had a cheerleader in your corner. In July of 2021, the Sohegan Valley Boys and Girls Club in Milford held a dedication ceremony for Jonathan. They unveiled a granite bench inscribed with a tribute to him, along with the club's mission statement. They also revealed a mural with the words "Be Great," which Jonathan had worked on with kids at the club. Jonathan's mother, Justine, wrote a story about her son's life that was read at the ceremony. She described how Jonathan would run for miles after school and then run straight to the Boys and Girls Club so he could volunteer. She talked about his service awards from 2 presidents, his scholarship to the Rochester Institute of Technology, his degree in biomedical engineering, his job at Teleflex, where he was working to install a new production line. Jonathan was inspired by the Boys and Girls Club to be great, she wrote. In turn, he tried to inspire others to be great. That, perhaps, is how we should remember Jonathan Amiro. Not for the horror of how his life ended, but for the way he lived. For the mountains he climbed, 66 of them, with just one left to conquer. For the 700 hours he gave to help children. For the way he encouraged his friends and coworkers to be better, to do more, to never stand still. For the kindness he showed to everyone, even to someone who would ultimately betray him. In April of 2025, the New Hampshire Supreme Court denied Armando Barron's appeal and upheld his conviction and sentence. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. Jonathan's family continues to grieve. His friends continue to remember him. The outdoor community he loved continues to share his stories and his passion for the mountains of New England. One of Jonathan's friends, David Depreux Wilson, wrote on social media after Jonathan's body was found, "My brother, my best man, has been found. He was murdered and left alone for 4 days. I am disgusted. I am angry and terribly sad. It's been more than 4 years now since that terrible September night in 2020. The park where Jonathan was attacked is still there, still peaceful during the day, still part of the larger Annie State Forest with its 1,500 acres of woods. The campsite in the northern woods is still remote and isolated. The mountains Jonathan loved to climb are still there, standing tall against the New Hampshire sky. But Jonathan is gone. At 25 years old, with so much life ahead of him, with one mountain left to climb, he was taken from this world by an act of senseless violence. His story reminds us that darkness can intrude even into the brightest lives, even in the quietest places. It reminds us that jealousy and rage can destroy not just one life, but many. The ripples spreading outward to touch everyone who loved the person who was lost. And it reminds us that goodness, kindness, and service matter. Jonathan Amero packed more incredible accomplishments into his 25 years than many people achieve in twice that time. He inspired others to be great. He was a cheerleader in the corner of everyone who knew him. That is his legacy. Remember that even in the darkest stories, there is light in how we remember those we've lost, and the good they did while they were here, and the lives they touched and the people they inspired to be better. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, I'll share with you a story that unfolded in the quiet suburbs of American Fork, Utah. This is a tale of marriage, family, and a conspiracy that would shatter lives forever. Let the words wash over you as we explore what happened on a summer night in 2024. It was Friday, July 12th, 2024. The sun had already set over the California desert as Matthew Rastelli began what would be his final journey. At 42 years old, Matthew was making the long drive from Temecula, California, to American Fork, Utah. He believed he was going to bring his family home. Matthew had been married to Catherine for 7 years. Together they had built a life in Southern California, raising their 3 young children. But for the past 3 weeks, Catherine had been staying at her mother's house in Utah with their children. She had told Matthew she needed a breather, some time away to think. Matthew had been calling her multiple times every day, just as he called his own mother, Diane. With the same frequency, he was a devoted son, a caring father, and despite the troubles in his marriage, he was trying to hold his family together. On that July day, Matthew had made plans to pick up his wife and children. Catherine had told him she couldn't rent a car to drive back to California. She said she had injured her ankle. Matthew, wanting to help and eager to reunite his family, offered to make the drive himself. He would come get them. He even booked a rental car for the return trip so they could all drive back together comfortably. As Matthew's truck rolled through the darkness, covering mile after mile of highway, he stayed in contact with Catherine. She was encouraging, helpful even. She told him which roads to take for the best route. She gave him her mother's address in American Fork. She provided him with the gate code for her mother's gated community. She even asked him to put down cardboard when he parked so his truck wouldn't leak oil on her mother's driveway. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed like a wife helping her husband find his way to her. What Matthew didn't know was that hidden somewhere in his truck, tucked beneath papers and receipts and random debris in a storage compartment, was a small device, an Apple AirTag. Someone had been tracking his every movement as he drove through the night, believing he was heading toward reconciliation. 3 people in American Fork were watching his location on their phones, waiting for him to arrive. Tracy Grist's home sat in a quiet, gated community in American Fork, Utah. At 59 years old, Tracy was Catherine's mother, and for the past 3 weeks, her home had been a refuge for her daughter and grandchildren. But something else had been brewing inside those walls. Something far darker than simple family support during a marital rough patch. Living at the house with Tracy was her son, Kevin Ellis, Catherine's 33-year-old brother. Kevin had a troubled past. He had accumulated multiple convictions in California between 2007 and 2014, including battery and several DUIs. These prior convictions meant he was legally prohibited from possessing firearms. He was what the law called a restricted person, but Kevin did possess a firearm. It was a 9mm semi-automatic handgun that Tracy had purchased from a client back in 2020. That gun was now in the house, waiting. In the days before Matthew's arrival, there had been conversations, text messages, internet searches. While Catherine claimed she wanted a divorce, she had consulted with a lawyer who told her she would need to file in California, where she and Matthew lived. She couldn't just take the children to Utah and file there. The legal reality was complicated, and it seemed to leave her feeling trapped, helpless about what to do next. Tracy, according to text messages police would later recover, had brought up an idea more than once. She or Kevin could kill Matthew. They would use a gun, she said, and put a knife in his hand to sell a story of self-defense. The plan began to take shape. In June, before Matthew's final drive, Tracy had been conducting internet searches. Police would later discover she had looked up gun laws in Utah. She had researched recent shootings in the state, and then there were the more disturbing searches. She looked up the name Daniel Markle, a Florida law professor who had been murdered in 2014 in a notorious murder-for-hire plot, orchestrated by his former in-laws during a bitter custody dispute. She also searched for Catherine Magvania and Donna Adelson, 2 of the people convicted in that conspiracy. The parallels were chilling. Catherine had her own searches. On her devices, investigators found she had been researching spousal homicide cases. She had also looked up an odd query: what attracts mountain lions to humans? And then there was the knife. In April, months before Matthew's death, Tracy had traveled to California to help a friend with estate planning after the friend's husband had passed away. During that trip, Tracy had access to tactical gear that the deceased man had collected through a subscription service. Among those items was an Evatac brand knife. Police would later find an email from Tracy's phone, dated April 10th, 2024, asking the tactical subscription company to stop sending boxes to the deceased man's address. That same type of knife would later be found at the scene of Matthew's death, placed in his hand. At approximately 10:06 in the evening on July 12th, a neighbor's security camera captured Matthew Rastelli's truck pulling up to Tracy Grist's home in American Fork. Matthew had driven for hours, believing he was about to see his wife and children, believing they would soon be heading home together. Catherine had told him the door would be unlocked. She had told him to just come in when he arrived. And so, trusting the woman he had married, Matthew approached the front door. Tracy had even removed the fabric screen door earlier that day, making it easier for Matthew to enter. She had moved toys from their usual location in the front room. She had covered the living room couch, perhaps anticipating what was to come. Matthew walked through that unlocked door. He stepped into the entryway, near the stairs. He called out, perhaps expecting to see his children. At 10:07, just 1 minute after his truck was captured on camera arriving, witnesses nearby heard gunshots. Not just 1 or 2, but multiple shots fired in rapid succession. Kevin Ellis had been waiting. According to what police would later piece together, Kevin shot Matthew multiple times. Shell casings. 8 of them would be found scattered in the living room near the front door and in the hallway where Matthew fell. Matthew was hit 6, possibly 7 times. 1 bullet struck him in the chest. 2 more struck him in the back. Another hit his right wrist, causing devastating damage, with both an entry and exit wound. Upstairs in a bedroom, Catherine waited with her children. Later, she would tell investigators she overheard her brother tell their mother to be careful because Matthew might still be moving. Matthew Restelli, a left-handed man, collapsed near the stairs in the entryway of his mother-in-law's home. He would never see his children again. He would never complete the drive back to California. His life ended there, on a floor in Utah, in a house he had never visited before. After the shots rang out at 10:07, something peculiar happened. There was silence. The house fell still. Minutes ticked by. Matthew lay on the floor, his life draining away. It wasn't until 10:25 in the evening, a full 18 minutes after the shooting, that someone finally called 911. When emergency responders arrived, they found Matthew Restelli face down, deceased. And there was something odd about the scene. In Matthew's right hand was a knife. The blade was facing inward, toward his body, not outward as it would be if he had been threatening someone. Matthew was left-handed, yet the knife was placed in his right hand, and that right hand had a devastating gunshot wound that had shattered his wrist, making it virtually impossible for him to have been gripping anything when he was shot. Police immediately noticed these inconsistencies. Detective Joseph Norden, who responded to the scene, later testified that it appeared the knife had been placed in Matthew's hand after he was already dead. Detectives believed that critical 2-minute gap between the shooting and the call to police was used to stage the scene, to create the appearance that Kevin Ellis had acted in self-defense against an armed intruder. When Kevin Ellis was questioned that night in the presence of his attorney, he claimed that Matthew had entered the house without permission, that he had taken Kevin and Tracy by surprise, that Matthew was agitated and carrying a knife. The attorney stated that Kevin feared for his life and shot in self-defense. But there were problems with this story. First, Tracy had told police she knew Matthew was coming. She knew he would arrive a little after 10 in the evening. Catherine certainly knew, as she had been guiding him there all day. This was not a surprise visit by an unwelcome intruder. Second, if Matthew had truly burst into the house wielding a knife, forcing Kevin to run to the garage to retrieve a gun from a safe, Matthew would have had time to penetrate deeper into the house. Instead, he was found just inside the entrance, suggesting he was ambushed almost immediately upon entering. Third, the knife itself was suspicious. Police found no record of Matthew ever purchasing an Evadac knife, but they did trace the knife back to Tracy's trip to California, where she had access to exactly that type of tactical knife. Kevin Ellis was arrested that night and charged with murder. Police seized the phones of Kevin, Tracy, and Catherine, but the investigation was only beginning. What they would find in those devices would reveal a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone initially imagined. In the days and weeks following Matthew's death, American Fork police detectives conducted what they would later describe as an intensive, time-consuming, and meticulous investigation. They combed through text messages, emails, internet search histories, and location data. What emerged was a picture of a carefully planned ambush. In May of 2024, 2 months before Matthew's death, Catherine had sent a text message to a friend. The message was chilling in its casualness. She wrote that she was trying to wait, but might murder Matt that day. At the time, it might have seemed like an exaggerated expression of frustration, but in hindsight, it appeared to be something far more sinister. The AirTag found hidden in Matthew's truck revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Police discovered that Catherine, Tracy, and Kevin all had access to this tracking device. They could all monitor Matthew's location in real time. Text messages showed they were tracking his movements and discussing his whereabouts in the minutes before he arrived at the house. Catherine's sister had even sent her screenshots from Apple Maps showing a blue dot in Aguanga, California, near Matthew's residence, demonstrating they were monitoring him from afar. The planning became even more evident when investigators reviewed the conversations between Catherine and Tracy. After Catherine consulted with a divorce attorney who told her she would need to return to California to file for divorce, the two women began working on a plan to keep her from having to go back. Tracy suggested Catherine fake a sprained ankle as a reason she couldn't rent a car. Text messages showed them discussing ways to avoid renting a vehicle in American Fork, all designed to get Matthew to make the drive to Utah instead. When investigators reviewed Catherine's communications with Matthew during his final drive, they found she had been the perfect conspirator. She never once told him not to come. She never said she didn't want to return to California. Instead, she helped him plan the best route. She provided the gate code. She made sure everything was ready for his arrival. She even recorded phone calls with Matthew on her iPad, ensuring he understood he should just walk into her mother's house when he got there. On the morning of July 12th, hours before Matthew would be killed, Catherine posted a message in a social media chat room. She wrote that she had to do big girl things that morning. The meaning of those words would become clear only in retrospect. The day after Matthew was killed, Catherine told a friend that her husband was dead. The friend expressed condolences. But what happened next was disturbing. While on a video call with this friend, Catherine displayed an image of blood where Matthew's body had been found. She then let her friend speak to Tracy. During that conversation, Tracy told the friend that she would have taken a picture of Matthew's body if she had known the friend liked true crime. 3 days after the shooting, on July 15th, this same friend filed a report with police about Catherine's earlier text message stating she might murder her husband. When Tracy called Matthew's mother, Diane, to inform her that her son was dead, Diane didn't learn any details about how he died. She had to find out from news reports that her son had been killed by Kevin Ellis. In a phone call that was later recorded and played in court, Diane confronted Tracy. Diane said that the whole thing felt like a setup. Tracy, in that conversation, described her son Kevin as gentle, kind, and sweet, insisting he had only acted in self-defense. But Diane Restelli knew her son. She knew he had been a caring, devoted father and son. She knew he called her multiple times every day. She knew that his last conversation with her had been just 2 hours before he arrived at that house in American Fork. The idea that he had burst in as an armed, aggressive intruder made no sense to her. In the upstairs bedroom where Catherine and the children had waited during the shooting, police found something else. Matthew had been shot and killed directly beneath the room where his own children slept. They were in the house when their father was murdered, just feet away, separated only by a floor and ceiling. Kevin Ellis was arrested on the night of the shooting, but it would be months before the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Investigators continued building their case, following every digital breadcrumb, every phone record, every witness statement. On October 29th, 2024, more than 3 months after Matthew's death, American Fork police arrested Catherine Restelli and Tracy Grist. Both women were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of domestic violence in the presence of a child. The American Fork Police Department announced that their investigation led them to believe the 2 women had worked together with Kevin Ellis to lure Matthew from California, so that Kevin could kill him. As Lieutenant Samantha Wasson of the American Fork Police would later note, it was rare to have a murder in their city, let alone one where someone was lured from another state specifically to be killed. The evidence against all 3 was substantial. Kevin had tested positive for cocaine after his arrest, and police found drug paraphernalia in his bedroom, including a rolled-up dollar bill with cocaine residue. His history of convictions and his status as a restricted person made his possession of the murder weapon an additional felony. Tracy's internet searches about the Marco case, gun laws, and custody issues painted a picture of someone researching how to get away with murder. And Catherine's texts, her cooperation in luring Matthew to the house, her fake ankle injury, and her complete lack of warning to Matthew about what awaited him all pointed to active participation in the conspiracy. All 3 remained in jail without the option to post bail as they awaited their trials. On July 17, 2025, nearly a year after Matthew's death, Catherine Restelli stood in a courtroom in Provo, Utah. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony discharge of a firearm. In exchange, prosecutors dismissed charges of obstruction of justice and 2 counts of domestic violence in the presence of a child. They also agreed not to file perjury charges against her for statements she had made at Kevin Ellis's bail hearing. In her plea statement, Catherine admitted everything. She admitted to leaving her husband on June 20th, 2024, taking their children to her mother's house because of marital issues. She admitted that her mother, on more than one occasion, brought up that she or Kevin would kill Matthew. Tracy had told her they would use a gun and put a knife in Matthew's hand to sell a story of self-defense. Catherine admitted that when she learned Matthew wanted to come get her, And the children, she led him to believe she was open to coming back, even though she had no intention of returning. She admitted to placing the tracking device in his truck. She admitted to staying in touch with him throughout his drive, reassuring him that all was well, keeping him calm and unsuspecting. She admitted she knew her brother and mother had lunch together on July 12th to finalize their plans to kill her husband. She admitted her mother removed the screen door, moved toys, and covered furniture to prepare for the murder. And she admitted that she stayed upstairs in a bedroom while Kevin shot Matthew, and that she overheard Kevin tell Tracy to be careful because Matthew might still be moving. She admitted to witnessing the aftermath, the staging, the lie. As part of the plea deal, prosecutors recommended that Catherine serve at least 6 years in prison, though her sentence could extend to life depending on the parole board's decisions. Her cooperation meant she would testify against her mother and brother at their upcoming trials. On September 9th, 2025, Catherine Restelli returned to court for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with Matthew's family, people who had loved him and were now left to pick up the pieces of shattered lives. Diane Restelli, Matthew's mother, stood before the judge and addressed her former daughter-in-law. Her words were heavy with grief. She spoke about how Matthew used to call her multiple times a day, how his death had created a massive hole in her heart that would never heal. She told Catherine that someday she hoped Catherine would understand the depth of her actions, but that understanding would never bring Matt back. She said Catherine had stripped her of her son's presence, that Matt's children would never know their incredible father as they grew into adulthood. Matthew's brothers Paul and Mark also spoke. Mark Restelli shared a painful memory. He said he regretted not speaking to his brother after a Father's Day barbecue in 2022. Mark admitted he had not been comfortable with Catherine, and that's why he hadn't invited Matthew and his family to another gathering. He said Matthew had been loyal to Catherine over everyone else in his life, even his own brothers. Catherine had him trapped, he said, injecting venom. Mark revealed that he and his wife were now raising Matthew's children along with their own, trying to give them the love and stability their father would have provided. When Catherine's turn came to speak, she cried. She said she was deeply sorry for the pain she had caused, that she understood her apology would never be enough to heal the hurt. She said Matthew didn't deserve what happened, and if she had the power to bring him back, she would. She claimed she had wanted to back out of the conspiracy, but the judge would later say he didn't believe her, noting she had days to stop the plan and chose not to. 4th District Judge Roger Griffin was not sympathetic. He sentenced Catherine Restelli to 1 to 15 years in prison for each of the murder and conspiracy charges, and 5 years to life for the felony discharge of a firearm. The murder and firearm sentences would run consecutively, meaning she would serve at least 6 years before being eligible for parole. But more than the prison time, the judge's words cut deep. Judge Griffin told Catherine that her selfish actions showed she didn't love her children at all. He said she made them victims, lifetime victims of her actions. He issued a protective order forbidding Catherine from ever contacting her children. He said they deserved to grow up without her in their lives. The children who had been upstairs that night, who had lost their father to violence orchestrated by their own mother, would now be raised by Matthew's family, the people who truly loved them. As Catherine Restelli began her prison sentence, her mother and brother prepared for their own days in court. Tracy Grist was scheduled for trial in January of 2026. Kevin Ellis would follow in February. Both faced charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Kevin also faced additional charges related to drug possession and illegal gun possession. Catherine was expected to testify against both of them, her cooperation part of the deal she made to reduce her own charges. The question remained whether a jury would believe that Kevin had knowingly participated in the conspiracy, or if, as his attorney argued, he had been used by his mother without fully understanding the plan. The evidence would be presented, witness testimony heard, and 12 citizens would decide. But for the Restelli family, no verdict would bring Matthew back. No prison sentence would restore the daily phone calls Diane cherished. No courtroom proceeding would return a father to 3 young children who would now grow up with memories fading and questions that could never be fully answered. Matthew's family vowed to be strong. Diane said they would do what Matthew would have done, caring for his children with love and dedication. She said she was certain Matthew was pleased that they were raising his children during these unspeakable times. because they loved him, cherished him, and respected the meaning of family. The murder of Matthew Rastelli is a story about trust betrayed in the most profound way possible. A man believed his wife when she said she needed space. He trusted her when she asked him to drive across state lines to bring his family home. He walked through an unlocked door, believing he was taking the first step toward reconciliation. Instead, he walked into an ambush, planned by the people who should have been his family through marriage. His wife lured him. His mother-in-law prepared the scene. His brother-in-law pulled the trigger, and all the while his children waited upstairs. Innocent victims of a conspiracy born from frustration, desperation, and a complete disregard for human life. The case bears haunting similarities to the murder of Daniel Marco, the Florida law professor killed in a murder-for-hire plot, orchestrated by his former in-laws during a custody dispute. That case, which Tracy Grist had researched online, showed the lengths some families will go to maintain control, to avoid the messy realities of divorce and custody battles. The parallels were not lost on investigators or prosecutors. In the end, 3 people made a choice. They chose murder over divorce proceedings. They chose violence over legal remedies. They chose to take a father from his children rather than navigate the difficult but lawful process of ending a marriage. And now they would spend years, perhaps the rest of their lives, behind bars for that choice. Matthew Rastelli was 42 years old when he died. He was a devoted son who called his mother multiple times every day. He was a father who cared deeply for his 3 children. He was a man trying to save his marriage, trying to keep his family together. His last conversation with his mother was just 2 hours before he arrived at that house in American Fork. He never made it home, but his children will. They will grow up knowing their father loved them, knowing their grandparents and uncles are raising them with the same devotion Matthew showed. They will grow up understanding that while evil touched their lives, that terrible night in July, love and family survived. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet hills of upstate New York. A story of dreams, betrayal, and a truth so devastating it shook an entire community to its core. This is the story of Kelly Clayton, a woman whose light burned bright, whose laughter filled rooms, and whose life was stolen in the darkest hours of a September night. But this is also a story about justice, about how the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth, and how love, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, refuses to be extinguished. In the heart of upstate New York, where autumn leaves paint the landscape in shades of amber and gold, there sits a small town called Elmira. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where high school football games draw crowds on Friday nights, and where the local hockey team becomes the pride of the entire community. This was the world that Kelly Stage grew up in, a world of small-town warmth and familiar faces. Kelly was born the youngest of 3 children to Elizabeth and Howard Stage. Her older sister Kim was 10 years her senior, and from the beginning, Kim felt a protective instinct toward this bright-eyed little girl, who would become her shadow, her companion, her baby sister. Those who knew Kelly in her youth remember her as bold and sassy, confident in a way that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She was pretty strikingly so, with blonde hair that caught the light and a dimpled smile that could disarm anyone. But her beauty was only part of her charm. Kelly was brave. She spoke her mind. She danced like nobody was watching. She cheered at football games and played softball with a competitive fire that surprised opponents who underestimated her. At Elmira Free Academy, the local high school, Kelly made a name for herself. She was an honor roll student, a cheerleader, a softball star. She moved through those hallways with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are, and not apologizing for it. Her father, Howard, ran the West Elmira Volunteer Fire Department, a position of respect in a community where volunteer firefighters are heroes. The Stage family was well known, well liked. They were woven into the fabric of Elmira life. After high school graduation in 1998, Kelly did what many young people from small towns dream of doing. She left. She went to college, explored the world beyond the borders of her hometown, and for a time she found herself drawn to the glittering lakes of Las Vegas, Nevada. About as far from Elmira as a person could get, both in miles and in spirit. In Las Vegas, Kelly worked as a teacher for a while, then transitioned to work as a cocktail waitress at the Imperial Palace. She loved it. The energy, the excitement, the constant motion. She once wore a 30-pound feather headdress as part of her costume, and she beamed with joy the entire night. This was Kelly, always willing to embrace the moment, always searching for the next adventure. But as bright and exciting as Las Vegas was, something was missing. The pull of home, of family, of that familiar small-town warmth, began to tug at her heart. And so, in the year 2000, Kelly returned to Elmira for Christmas. It was a decision that would change the entire trajectory of her life. While Kelly had been discovering herself in the Nevada desert, Elmira had found a new source of pride. The Elmira Jackals, a semi-professional hockey team that called the town home. Hockey in upstate New York is more than just a sport. It's a religion. The Jackals regularly sold out their arena for home games, and the players became local celebrities, their faces recognized at grocery stores and gas stations, their presence bringing excitement to a town that didn't get much national attention. One of those players was Thomas Clayton. Thomas was born in Binghamton, New York, and attended Niagara University, where he played college hockey. He was talented enough to catch the attention of scouts, and in 1998 he joined the Elmira Jackals as a forward. For 4 seasons from 1998 to 2002, Thomas Clayton skated across that ice, earning cheers and building a reputation not just for his skills, but for his good looks and rugged personality. When Kelly returned to Elmira for Christmas in 2000, her sisters took her to a Jackals game. The arena was packed, the energy electric, and there on the ice, Kelly spotted Thomas Clayton. The attraction was immediate and intense. Thomas was handsome, athletic, charming, everything that catches a young woman's eye. And Thomas, for his part, was equally drawn to Kelly. She was beautiful, confident, full of life. They were by all outward appearances a perfect match. Within a year, Kelly and Thomas were married. Kelly's stage became Kelly Clayton, and the couple settled into married life. They spent some time in North Carolina, where Thomas continued pursuing hockey opportunities. But eventually they returned to the place where their story began, Elmira. By 2008, their family had grown. Kelly gave birth to their daughter, Charlie, a precocious child who would inherit her mother's intelligence and her father's intensity. A few years later, their son Cullen was born, completing the picture of what seemed to be an ideal American family. Thomas, by this time, had transitioned away from professional hockey. An injury had ended his playing career, but he'd pivoted successfully into business. He became the owner of a franchise for Paul Davis Emergency Services, specializing in water and fire damage restoration. He also worked as a project manager for ServPro, a similar company owned by a friend. Kelly embraced motherhood while also working as a waitress to help support the family. 2 outsiders looking in. The Claytons seemed to have it all. A handsome former athlete, his beautiful wife, 2 adorable children, and a comfortable home on Ginen Road in the town of Caton, just outside Elmira. But behind the smiling family photos and the picture-perfect facade, cracks were forming. Deep, dark cracks that no one on the outside could see. In the year leading up to September 2015, Thomas Clayton's life had become a carefully constructed web of lies. To Kelly, he was the devoted husband, the hard-working father trying to build a better life for his family. He would send her loving text messages throughout the day, checking in, saying sweet things, playing the role of the attentive spouse. But his phone told a different story. While Thomas was texting Kelly with words of affection, he was simultaneously sending messages to other women. Messages that were sexual in nature. Messages that painted a very different picture of his commitment to his marriage. During the investigation that would later unfold, multiple women came forward with the same story. They had been involved with Thomas Clayton while he was married to Kelly. 3 of these women would eventually testify in court, describing relationships that ranged from brief encounters to ongoing affairs. But more troubling than the infidelity itself were the things Thomas said to these women about his wife. He complained about Kelly constantly. He made disparaging remarks about her, painting her as an obstacle to his happiness. a burden he longed to shed. And to more than one of these women, Thomas said something chilling. He couldn't divorce Kelly because she would take everything from him. The finances, the house, the custody of the children. Thomas believed that leaving Kelly through legal means would destroy him financially. In his mind, he was trapped. But Thomas Clayton was also a planner, a schemer, someone who believed he was smarter than everyone around him. And in the months leading up to September 2015, he began to formulate a solution to his problem. A solution that was as cold-blooded as it was calculated. About a year before Kelly's death, Thomas took out a life insurance policy on his wife. The policy was substantial, but Thomas had even considered increasing it to over $1 million. Combined with the homeowner's insurance, survivor benefits from the children, and the equity in their home, Kelly was worth far more to Thomas dead than divorced. But to pull off what he was planning, Thomas would need help. He would need someone who was desperate enough, someone who owed him enough, someone who could be manipulated into doing the unthinkable. He found that person in Michael Beard. Michael Beard was an African-American man, 6 feet and 1 inch tall, weighing about 200 pounds. He had worked for Thomas Clayton in the restoration business, doing various jobs around the Clayton home and property. He knew the layout of the house well. He knew the family's routine. He knew which doors were usually locked and which provided easier access. But just 12 days before Kelly Clayton's murder, Thomas fired Michael Beard from his position. The termination was devastating for Beard. He had been renting an apartment from Thomas, and without his job, he couldn't afford to pay the rent. He didn't own a vehicle. He didn't have a driver's license. In the span of a single decision, Michael Beard had lost his job, his income, and his housing security. He was desperate, vulnerable. Exactly what Thomas Clayton needed. Phone records would later reveal that in the days following Beard's termination, Thomas and Michael were in frequent contact. This was unusual. Why would a business owner maintain regular communication with a recently fired employee? The prosecution would argue that this was when Thomas made his pitch, when he dangled a solution to Beard's problems in exchange for an unspeakable act. According to Michael Beard's initial confession to police, Thomas Clayton offered him $10,000 to kill Kelly and burn down the house, making it look like a robbery gone wrong. The fire would destroy evidence, and Thomas would collect on both the life insurance and the homeowner's insurance. To facilitate the plan, Thomas bought Michael Beard a bicycle, a mode of transportation that wouldn't require a license and would be difficult to trace. He also gave Beard a key to the Clayton home, specifically to the garage door entrance, so there would be no need for forced entry. The plan was meticulous, cold, calculated, and it required Thomas to have an airtight alibi for the night when his wife would die. September 28, 2015 was a Monday night. The air was thick and muggy. A tropical storm was considering hurricane status a few miles south. Though in Caden it hadn't started raining yet, Thomas Clayton had a standing Monday night poker game at his friend Greg Miller's house. It was a regular occurrence, something that wouldn't raise any suspicions. On this particular night, Thomas left his home around 7:30 in the evening, leaving Kelly at home with their 2 children. 7-year-old Charlie and her younger brother Cullen, who was just 5 years old at the time. Kelly had no reason to be concerned. Monday night poker was routine. She put the children to bed, settled into her own bedroom, and drifted off to sleep, unaware that across town a series of events was being set in motion that would end her life before the sun rose again. At the poker game, Thomas Clayton played his part perfectly. He joked with friends, he played cards, he seemed relaxed, normal, just another guy enjoying a weekly game with the boys. Multiple witnesses would later confirm that Thomas was at Greg Miller's house that night, establishing an alibi that seemed unshakable. But at approximately 10:45 in the evening, Thomas did something unusual. He asked Greg's wife if he could borrow her cell phone to make a call. When she handed him her phone, Thomas stepped away and dialed a number. The call went to Michael Beard. It was a brief call, just long enough to give a signal to confirm that the plan was proceeding. And on the other end of that line, Michael Beard received the message loud and clear. It was time. After receiving the call from Thomas Clayton, Michael Beard went into motion. He had recruited another man to help him, Mark Blanford, who would serve as his lookout and driver for the night. Together they drove to the parking lot of ServPro, the company where Thomas worked. Surveillance cameras captured what happened next. A maroon truck, one that belonged to Thomas's colleague Luke Tetrault, was parked at the lot. Just 2 days earlier, on September 26th, Luke had come to the Clayton home to pick up a four-wheeler for a weekend event. On September 28th, Thomas had suggested switching vehicles to make unloading easier. It was a seemingly innocent exchange, but it put Luke's truck at ServPro, where it could be used without raising suspicion. Michael Beard and Mark Blandford got into Luke's truck and drove toward Ginnin Road. The time was approximately 11:45 at night. Phone records show that Beard's cell phone was turned off around this time. No pings, no location data, nothing to trace his movements. They arrived at the Clayton home shortly after midnight. Mark Blandford stayed in the truck, parked out of sight while Michael Beard approached the house. He had the key Thomas had given him. He entered through the garage door, just as planned, and made his way inside. Upstairs, Kelly Clayton was asleep in her bedroom, completely unaware of the intruder moving through her home in the darkness. Michael Beard climbed the stairs. He knew the layout, he knew where to go, and in his hands he held a fiberglass maul handle, a tool used for splitting wood, heavy and brutal in its simplicity. He entered Kelly's bedroom and struck her twice with the maul handle while she lay in bed. The blows were vicious, meant to be lethal, but Kelly Clayton was a fighter. Despite the stunning pain, despite the shock and terror, she fought back. She managed to get out of bed and run from the bedroom. Her only thought was survival and protecting her children. She ran down the hallway toward Charlie's bedroom at the end of the hall, where her 7-year-old daughter had been awakened by the sounds of violence. Charlie's door opened. The little girl stepped into the hallway and saw a nightmare unfolding before her eyes. A masked man chasing her mother bleeding and screaming. And in that moment of pure terror and maternal instinct, Kelly Clayton screamed 3 words that would echo through the investigation and trial. "Run, Charlie, run." Kelly tried to escape down the stairs, but she stumbled and fell, crashing into the wall on the landing with enough force to leave a hammer-sized hole in the sheetrock. She tumbled down the stairs, her body battered, her head bleeding, but still she fought to get away. She made it to the bottom of the stairs, crossed the dining room, reached the kitchen, but Michael Beard caught up with her. What happened next was savage, brutal, almost impossible to comprehend. Beard struck Kelly again and again with the maul handle, focusing on her head and face. The blows shattered bones, destroyed tissue, left blood spattered across the walls and floor. Kelly Clayton fought until she couldn't fight anymore. Her body, once so full of life and energy and dancing and joy, went still on the kitchen floor. Michael Beard, breathless and sweating, grabbed the maul handle and fled the house. He ran back to the truck where Mark Blandford was waiting. The surveillance footage from ServPro would later show the truck returning to the parking lot at 12:55 in the morning. Someone, presumably Michael Beard, left the parking lot a few minutes later on a bicycle. On the drive back, Beard and Blandford disposed of evidence. They threw the maul handle into a small creek. They discarded bloody clothes into water at another location. They tried to erase what had happened, but they couldn't erase what Charlie Clayton had seen. The poker game at Greg Miller's house broke up around midnight. Thomas Clayton got into his vehicle and drove home, his GPS tracking his route, confirming his movements for the alibi he had so carefully constructed. He arrived home at approximately 12:30 in the morning on September 29th, 2015, a Tuesday. The beginning of what should have been an ordinary day. Thomas entered his home and immediately knew something was wrong. There was blood, so much blood. A trail leading from upstairs, down the stairwell, into the kitchen, where Kelly lay on the floor, naked from the waist down, her head injuries catastrophic. Thomas found his children, Charlie and Cullen, both alive, both traumatized. Charlie told her father there had been a robbery, that a man had hurt Mommy. Thomas shuttled the children to a neighbor's house, then called 911. The recording of that call would later be played in court. Thomas's voice frantic and broken. "My wife. She's dead." When the police arrived at 2181 Ginnin Road, they entered a scene that would haunt even experienced investigators for years to come. Deputy Dean Swan, wearing a body camera, surveyed the carnage and muttered, "She's been beat to death. I got a body cam on to show where we went. It is extremely bloody." Donald Lewis, an investigator for the Steuben County Sheriff's Office, would later describe it as an extremely brutal attack. A very gruesome situation. There were signs of struggle in the upstairs bedroom, blood trails down the hallway, the hole in the sheetrock at the bottom of the stairs, and finally Kelly's body in the kitchen, surrounded by a halo of blood. The medical examiner determined that Kelly Clayton had died of severe blunt force trauma to the head and face. Her skull was fractured. Her brain was damaged. She had defensive wounds on her hands and fingers, broken bones that testified to her desperate attempts to protect herself. The brutality of the attack was shocking, but what troubled investigators even more was what they didn't find. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Thomas kept two safes in the house, one under his bed and another in the basement, both filled with cash. Thomas was known to carry large amounts of money, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. He was a gambler who frequented casinos and high-stakes poker games. If this had been a robbery, why hadn't the intruder taken anything? One of the officers at the scene noted on his body camera that it looked like a domestic, and within 24 hours, Thomas Clayton was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But Thomas wasn't the one who had killed Kelly. The truth was far more complicated and far more disturbing. While investigators processed the crime scene and began building their case against Thomas Clayton, they had one piece of evidence that would prove more valuable than any forensic analysis or phone record. An eyewitness. Charlie Clayton was 7 years old. She was gifted at mathematics and gymnastics, a bright child with a sharp mind, and she had seen the man who killed her mother. Sheriff Jim Allard was one of the first officials to speak with Charlie. He met her at a neighbor's house shortly after her mother's body was discovered. He sat down with the little girl and gently asked her what she had seen. A man was hurting Mommy, Charlie told him, and Mommy was yelling, "Run, Charlie, run." Allard asked more questions, trying to understand what Charlie remembered. And then he asked something simple. "How do you know it was a man?" Charlie's response sent chills down his spine. Because his eyes looked just like Daddy's. A few hours later, Charlie was brought to the Steuben County Child Advocacy Center. Not a harsh interrogation room, but a comfortable space designed for children. A forensic interviewer, trained in talking to young witnesses, sat down with her. The interview was not recorded for the public, but those who were present described Charlie's composure as remarkable and heartbreaking. This 7-year-old girl, who had just witnessed the brutal murder of her mother, sat calmly and described everything she remembered. She talked about seeing a man hurting Mommy. She described what the man was wearing, jeans and a mask. When asked if she had ever seen anyone wearing that mask before, Charlie said yes. She had seen her daddy wearing it. And then came the question that would haunt everyone who heard it. Could it have been your daddy? Charlie thought about it. She knew what she had seen. The eyes, the mask, the clothing. But accepting that possibility meant accepting something no child should ever have to contemplate. Finally, she said, "It could have been my dad, but he looked real. He looked like my dad, but it couldn't have been Daddy. Because then who would take care of us?" In that single statement, Charlie revealed both the truth and her desperate need to believe in an alternative reality. One where her father still loved her, still wanted to protect her. Her testimony, even with all its complexity and childhood reasoning, pointed investigators in exactly the right direction. With Thomas Clayton's arrest, the investigation kicked into high gear. Detectives began pulling phone records, analyzing GPS data, interviewing witnesses, and following every lead. They quickly identified Michael Beard as a person of interest. The phone call Thomas made from Greg Miller's wife's phone at 10:45 on the night of the murder. It had gone to Beard. The two men had been in frequent contact in the days leading up to Kelly's death. Unusual for a recently fired employee and his former boss. Cell tower records showed that Thomas and Michael had been together in the Elmira area on the morning of September 21st. About a week before the murder, on September 24th, another witness, Larry Johnson, a former Servpro employee, testified that he had driven with Michael Beard close to the Clayton home in Thomas's car. After midnight, Larry said he stayed in the car while Michael left for about half an hour. It appeared that the murder had been planned for an earlier date, but something had gone wrong. The plan had been delayed, recalibrated, and finally executed on September 28th. When police brought Michael Beard in for questioning, he initially confessed to everything. He told investigators that Thomas Clayton had hired him to kill Kelly and burn down the house. Thomas had promised him $10,000. The fire was supposed to destroy the evidence, but Beard had gotten scared and fled before setting it ablaze. It was fortunate he did. Charlie and Cullen were still in the house. Beard led police to the murder weapon, the fiberglass maul handle that had been thrown into a creek. He showed them where he had discarded his bloody clothes. He admitted that he had keys to the Clayton home, given to him by Thomas, and DNA analysis would later confirm that Michael Beard's genetic material was found on the murder weapon and at the crime scene. The case against Beard seemed airtight, but would the evidence be enough to convict Thomas Clayton, the man who had orchestrated the entire plot while maintaining the perfect alibi? Michael Beard was tried first in November of 2016. By this time, Beard had changed his story. He claimed that Thomas Clayton hadn't hired him to kill Kelly at all. Instead, he said Thomas had hired him to help with an insurance scam, to burn down the house while the family was away, so Thomas could collect the insurance money. Beard claimed that when he arrived at the house that night, he found Kelly already dead, panicked, and fled. In court, speaking directly to Kelly's family, Beard said, "I did not kill that person. I'm sorry for your loss. I know you mourn, but I, Michael Beard, did not kill Kelly Clayton. May God rest her soul." But the evidence told a different story. The DNA, the murder weapon, the testimony of Mark Blandford, who told investigators that Beard had said, "I'm going to have to kill a bitch on the way to the Clayton home," the timeline that placed Beard at the scene at the exact moment of Kelly's death. The jury didn't believe Beard's revised story. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now it was Thomas Clayton's turn. His trial began in January of 2017. Unlike Beard's trial, which had physical evidence directly linking him to the crime, the case against Thomas was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Thomas Clayton maintained his innocence throughout. His defense attorneys argued that there was no direct proof he had hired Beard to kill Kelly. Yes. They had worked together. Yes, Thomas had been in contact with Beard, but that didn't prove a murder-for-hire plot. The prosecution, however, methodically built their case. They brought in the women Thomas had affairs with, who testified about his complaints regarding Kelly and his statements that he couldn't divorce her because she would take everything. They presented the life insurance policy. They showed the cell phone records proving Thomas and Beard were in frequent contact and had been in close proximity multiple times in the days before the murder. They presented the evidence that Thomas had bought Beard a bicycle days before the murder. They showed how Thomas had arranged to swap vehicles with Luke Tetrold, putting Luke's truck at Serpro where Beard could access it. And perhaps most damning of all, they presented Charlie's testimony. The eyes that looked like Daddy's, the mask that Daddy had worn, the description that matched Thomas Clayton in every detail except for the fact that Thomas had the perfect alibi. Special Prosecutor Wetmore argued that Thomas Clayton was a cold-blooded killer who had orchestrated his wife's murder for money and freedom. He wanted out of the marriage. He wanted the insurance payout, and he believed he was smart enough to get away with it. The trial lasted 7 weeks. More than 75 witnesses testified. The jury heard every detail of the case, from the brutal crime scene to the phone records, to the heartbreaking testimony about a 7-year-old girl who saw a man with eyes like her father's killing her mother. So on February 14th, 2017, Valentine's Day, the jury began their deliberations. 6 hours later, they returned with their verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. In April of 2017, Thomas Clayton stood before the court for sentencing. Kelly's family was there, her sister Kim Bourgeois, who had taken in Charlie and Cullen after their mother's death, and was raising them as her own. Her mother Elizabeth, who had gotten a tattoo in Kelly's memory as a way to keep her daughter close. Her community, many wearing purple ribbons to signify domestic violence awareness. Kim read a statement on behalf of Charlie, who had written a letter on her own. The letter said that Charlie loved her mom. She loved her dad, but her dad was a coward because he made Michael Beard kill Mommy. Kim addressed the court directly, her voice steady despite the tears. She said that if Thomas's plan had come to fruition, he would have been done with his wife and his children. He would have collected Kelly's $1 million life insurance policy, survivor benefits from the children, homeowners insurance. He would have truly benefited financially from the death of all of them. "You took her life," Kim said, looking at Thomas, "not her light. And her light will shine forever, through her children, through me, through my brother, through my mother, forever, and we'll be okay. The judge sentenced Thomas Clayton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to Sing Sing prison in Ossining, New York, where he remains to this day. Thomas filed an appeal, claiming that the prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, and that cell phone technology and GPS data were not reliable enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In 2019, the appeals court upheld his conviction. Thomas's attorney has indicated he will continue appealing to higher courts, but as of now, the conviction stands. Michael Beard also remains in prison, serving his life sentence. Mark Blandford, lookout who drove Beard to Clayton home, pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter for his role in the case and received a lesser sentence. In the years since Kelly Clayton's murder, the community of Elmira and Caton has worked to heal. In March of 2017, the Elmira Jackals, Thomas Clayton's former team, hosted a domestic violence awareness night in memory of Kelly. All ticket proceeds went to support Charlie and Cullen. The children were there that night, dropping the first puck in a ceremony that brought tears to everyone present. Purple ribbons and Justice for Kelly lawn signs appeared throughout the community and remained long after the trials concluded. Local organizations focused on domestic violence prevention used Kelly's story to educate others about the warning signs of abuse and the devastating consequences of intimate partner violence. Charlie and Cullen had been living with Kim Bourgeois and her husband, surrounded by love and support. Kim has said that those children are what gets her up every day, that she has to keep going for them. She has made it her mission to ensure that Kelly's memory lives on, that her sister's light continues to shine through the lives of her children. The house on Ginnan Road was listed for sale in the months after the murder. It sold eventually to buyers who hoped to create new memories in a place that had seen such horror. Elizabeth Stage, Kelly's mother, continues to remember her daughter through the tattoo she got in Kelly's honor, and through her grandchildren, who carry pieces of their mother in their smiles, their personalities, their spirits. Even now, years after the conviction, questions linger. How could Thomas Clayton, a man who seemed to have everything, make such a cold, calculated decision to end his wife's life? What darkness lived inside him that allowed him to smile and joke at a poker game while knowing that miles away a hired killer was beating his children's mother to death? Investigators like Donald Lewis have said that this was the most interesting and complicated case they've ever been part of. Everything about Thomas Clayton's guilt was circumstantial. There was no recording of him hiring Beard, no paper trail of payment, no smoking gun. But as Lewis noted, you could explain away one call, one circumstance, but you couldn't explain all of it away. The pattern of behavior, the affairs, the complaints about Kelly, the statements that he couldn't divorce her, the life insurance policy, the timing of Beard's firing, the phone calls, the vehicle swap, the borrowed phone at the poker game, the cell tower data. All of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Thomas Clayton wanted his wife dead. He found someone desperate enough to do it, and he orchestrated a plan that he believed would give him the perfect alibi. But he made one critical mistake. He underestimated the courage and clarity of his 7-year-old daughter. Charlie Clayton's testimony, as heartbreaking as it was, became the foundation of the case against her father. Her description of the attacker, the eyes, the mask, the clothing, pointed investigators toward the truth. And even though she desperately wanted to believe it couldn't have been her daddy, because then who would take care of them? Her honesty about what she saw helped bring justice for her mother. As we reach the end of this story, take a moment to breathe, to reflect, to remember. Kelly Clayton was 35 years old when she died. She was a daughter, sister, a mother. She was brave and bold and sassy. She loved to dance. She dreamed of modeling. She worked hard to support her family. She loved her children fiercely enough to use her last breath screaming for her daughter to run. Her life was stolen by someone who vowed to love and protect her. But her light, as her sister Kim promised, continues to shine. Through Charlie, who showed remarkable courage in the face of unimaginable trauma. Through Cullen, who was too young to understand what happened, but who carries his mother's memory in his DNA. Through Kim, who refused to let grief consume her and instead channeled it into love for her sister's children. Through the community of Elmira and Caden, who rallied around this family and demanded justice. And through stories like this one, which ensure that Kelly Clayton is remembered not just as a victim, but as a person, a whole complex, beautiful person who deserved so much more than the 49 minutes of terror that ended her life in a darkened kitchen in September of 2015. If there is a lesson in this tragedy, perhaps it's this. The truth has a way of revealing itself. Love, real love doesn't manipulate or deceive or destroy. And courage can come from the smallest, most unexpected places. Like a 7-year-old girl sitting in a room with investigators, telling them about the eyes she saw through a mask. Justice for Kelly Clayton was served. Thomas Clayton and Michael Beard will spend the rest of their lives behind bars. But no verdict, no sentence can bring back what was lost. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, hold your loved ones a little closer. Speak kindly. Love fiercely. And remember that every life is precious. Every moment is a gift. And the light we bring into this world can continue to shine long after we're gone. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to walk through a story together. A true story from Charlottesville, Virginia. A story about a young woman, a community that rallied, and the pursuit of justice that followed. Take a deep breath in and out. It's early September 2014 in the historic college town of Charlottesville, Virginia. The University of Virginia campus was alive with the energy of a new semester. Students filled the tree-lined walkways, their backpacks heavy with textbooks, their minds filled with possibility. Among them was Hannah Elizabeth Graham. She was 18 years old, a sophomore with a bright smile, and an even brighter future. Hannah was the kind of young woman who left an impression. At 5 feet 11 inches tall, with light brown hair, blue eyes and freckles scattered across her face, she stood out in a crowd. But it wasn't just her height or her appearance that people remembered. It was her kindness, her intelligence, her genuine care for others. Hannah had been born in Reading, England, on a winter day in February of 1996. When she was just 5 years old, her family made the journey across the Atlantic, settling in northern Virginia. She grew up in Fairfax County, attending West Potomac High School near Alexandria, where she excelled both in the classroom and on the softball field. She was an athlete, a scholar, and a friend to many. Her parents, John and Susan Graham, watched their daughter flourish at the University of Virginia. She was earning straight A's, just as she had in high school. But Hannah was more than just academically accomplished. She had a heart for service. The previous spring break, when many of her peers were relaxing on beaches, Hannah had traveled to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to help rebuild houses damaged by tornadoes. That was who she was. Someone who saw need and answered it. She carried a stuffed bunny named BB everywhere. Her father would later reveal it was her guardian angel, he said, a small comfort from childhood that she kept close. In September of 2014, Hannah was beginning her second year at UVA. The world was open before her, full of promise and opportunity. She had no way of knowing that her life would soon become the center of a mystery that would grip not just Charlottesville, but the entire nation. September 12th, 2014. It was a Friday evening, the kind that feels electric with possibility when you're 18 and surrounded by friends. Hannah left her apartment at the Grand Mark complex at 9:33 in the evening. She was dressed casually in a black crop top and jeans. Her plan was simple: meet friends, go to a party, enjoy the start of the weekend. By 10:48 that night, she was at Fig Restaurant with friends, laughing and talking. The evening unfolded the way 1,000 college Friday nights unfold, with music and conversation and the easy comfort of being young. Around midnight, Hannah made her way to another location, the Camden Plaza Apartments on 14th Street, where another party was happening. She arrived. She stayed for a while, and then, for reasons that would later become crucial to understanding what happened, Hannah left, alone. This is where the story shifts, where the ordinary Friday night becomes something else entirely, at 12:45 in the morning. Now technically Saturday the 13th. A surveillance camera outside a pub captured Hannah walking past. She approached the entrance, but the doorman turned her away. She continued walking, At 12:46, another camera caught her outside McGrady's Irish pub, 3/4 of a mile from where she'd started. She was moving through the night alone, her path taking her deeper into downtown Charlottesville's pedestrian mall area. 10 minutes later, at 12:56 in the morning, Hannah sent a text message to her friends. It was cryptic, brief. "I got stuck down, though." She added that she was lost, trying to find a party. The message was sent at 1:20 in the morning. It would be the last time anyone heard from Hannah Graham. But the surveillance cameras kept watching. They captured her at 1:06 in the morning, walking past an Italian cafe. 2 minutes later, she passed a jewelry store. The footage showed something concerning. Hannah wasn't walking steadily. She appeared disoriented, unsteady on her feet, intoxicated. Investigators would later determine she was vulnerable, and she was being watched. While Hannah was making her way through downtown Charlottesville, a man named Jesse Leroy, Matthew Jr., was also out that night. He was 32 years old, a patient technician at the University of Virginia Hospital. He'd also worked as a cab driver. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, with dreadlocks, and he was known around the local bars. That Friday night, Matthew had been bar hopping alone. Multiple witnesses would later tell police that his behavior had been aggressive, inappropriate. At a place called the Lazy Parrot, he'd approached a woman sitting alone at the bar. He touched her hands repeatedly, even after she told him she had a boyfriend. She eventually sat on her hands to prevent him from continuing. He told her how nice her lips were. He asked for her phone number. At another bar called Rapture, he touched a woman's leg. When she told him not to touch her, he looked at her in what she described as a crazy way. Other women reported similar experiences that night. He was groping, touching, making unwanted advances. People who saw him that night remembered thinking he seemed off, too aggressive. Unable to read social cues. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Jesse Matthew was caught on surveillance camera. He was walking on the downtown mall. And then the footage captured something chilling. Matthew appeared to notice Hannah. The camera showed him following her, adjusting his pace and direction to stay close. At one point, he attempted to high-five a woman walking with her friend. The woman ignored him, but her friend returned the gesture. Moments later, that same woman watched as Matthew walked up to a young woman walking alone, a woman she would later identify as likely being Hannah Graham. Matthew put his arm around her. The witness turned to her friend and said something that would later haunt investigators. He doesn't know her. And then, more ominously, he's gonna fuck her up. The surveillance footage showed Matthew walking with his arm around Hannah's waist. They moved together toward a restaurant called Tempo. Multiple cameras captured them. He appeared protective, proprietary. She appeared unsteady. They entered Tempo together. Credit card receipts would later show that at 1:10 in the morning, Matthew purchased drinks for $15.30. A woman working the door at Tempo that night would remember seeing a young woman who appeared intoxicated, with Matthew holding her upright. And then, within about 15 minutes of that purchase, they left. A vehicle matching Matthew's burnt orange 1998 Chrysler Sebring was seen within a block of the restaurant. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. A witness who was outside saw Hannah and Matthew standing by his car. And the witness heard Hannah say something, 6 words, that would become central to understanding her final moments. "I'm not getting in that car with you." The witness described Matthew as looking unfriendly, described Hannah as resistant, but the witness couldn't stay, couldn't intervene. And whatever happened next happened out of view of cameras and witnesses. Hannah Graham disappeared into the night. By Saturday afternoon, Hannah's friends were worried. She hadn't come home. She wasn't answering her phone. This wasn't like her. Not like her at all. On Sunday, September 14th, her parents received the news that would begin every parent's worst nightmare. Hannah was missing. She'd last been seen in the early hours of Saturday morning, and no one had heard from her since. The Charlottesville Police Department, led by Chief Timothy Longo, immediately began investigating. They pulled surveillance footage from dozens of businesses along the downtown mall. They interviewed witnesses. They constructed a timeline of Hannah's movements that Friday night and Saturday morning. And slowly a picture emerged of a young woman who'd been vulnerable, alone, and ultimately encountered someone who meant her harm. The university community mobilized. On September 20th, Over 1,000 volunteers gathered to search for Hannah. They combed through fields and woods around Charlottesville. The Department of Emergency Management organized two-person search teams. For 44 hours they searched. Property owners were asked to check their own land. The search expanded to include U.S. Route 29, where other young women had disappeared in previous years. Hannah's parents made a public plea. Her father, John Graham, held BB, Hannah's beloved stuffed bunny, as he spoke to the cameras. "Hannah is beyond precious to us," they said in a statement. "We are truly devastated by her disappearance. It's totally out of character for us not to have heard from her, and we fear foul play." John Graham told reporters about his daughter's character, about how she'd spent her spring break rebuilding houses in Tuscaloosa instead of relaxing on a beach. "She loved helping people," he said, his voice breaking. The community held candlelight vigils. Hundreds of students, faculty, and Charlottesville residents gathered. Many who'd never met Hannah, but felt compelled to show support. Flyers with her photo appeared throughout the city. Digital billboards along highways displayed her image. The FBI joined the investigation, and investigators kept returning to one name, Jesse Matthew. Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. had a past that should have stopped him long before September of 2014. In October of 2002, when he was a student at Liberty University in Lynchburg, a woman reported that Matthew had raped her. Matthew told authorities the encounter was consensual. The woman didn't want to pursue charges, and investigators determined there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. No charges were filed. Matthew left Liberty University shortly after. Less than a year later, in September of 2003, another woman at Christopher Newport University in Newport News reported a sexual assault involving Matthew. Again, police investigated. Again, no charges were filed. Matthew quit the football team and left the school. 2 allegations, 2 universities, 2 women who reported assaults, and Jesse Matthew walked away both times. In September of 2005, a woman in Fairfax, Virginia, was grabbed from behind outside her home. She was choked until she lost consciousness. When she woke, she was being sexually assaulted. The attacker fled. A DNA sample was collected, but for years there was no match in the system. The case went cold. Jesse Matthew continued living in Charlottesville. He worked at the University of Virginia Hospital. He drove a cab. He frequented the downtown bars. He lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. But he wasn't ordinary. He was a predator. And in October of 2009, he would claim another victim. On October 17th, 2009, a 20-year-old Virginia Tech student named Morgan Dana Harrington attended a Metallica concert at the University of Virginia's John Paul Jones Arena with 3 friends. During the opening act, Morgan told her friends she needed to use the restroom. She left the arena. For reasons that remain unclear, Morgan wasn't allowed back inside. Arena policy didn't permit re-entry. Morgan was locked out in an unfamiliar area at night. She began trying to hitchhike. Jesse Matthew was driving his taxicab that night, working the area around the arena. Morgan's friends realized she wasn't coming back. They searched for her after the concert. They called her phone. Nothing. Morgan Dana Harrington had vanished. In November of 2009, her Pantera t-shirt was found outside an apartment building about 1.5 miles from the arena. In January of 2010, Morgan's skeletal remains were discovered on a farm in rural Albemarle County. She'd been murdered. DNA evidence was collected, but for years it led nowhere. Morgan's parents, Jill and Dan Harrington, became advocates for missing persons. They kept their daughter's case in the public eye. They pushed for answers. They believed their daughter's killer was still out there, still dangerous. They were right. As investigators built their case around Hannah Graham's disappearance, they focused intensely on Jesse Matthew. The surveillance footage placed him with her. Witnesses placed him with her. His behavior that night had been concerning, aggressive. On September 20th, 2014, a week after Hannah disappeared, police executed a search warrant on Matthew's apartment. They were looking for evidence. On September 21st, police issued an arrest warrant for Matthew for reckless driving, a tactical move to bring him in. On September 22nd, police searched his apartment again. This time, they found something significant. They took items of clothing. They wouldn't elaborate on what they'd found, but investigators described it as a major break in the case. On September 23rd, Chief Longo announced that Jesse Matthew had been charged with abduction with intent to defile. It was a serious charge, carrying significant prison time, but it wasn't murder. Not yet. Hannah was still missing. Jesse Matthew had been questioned earlier by police, but he'd come to the station with an attorney, stayed briefly, and then fled in his car, speeding away before detectives could conduct a proper interview. After the charges were announced, Matthew ran. He drove south, through Virginia, through the Carolinas. He made it all the way to Texas. But before leaving, he'd gone to the DMV to get a replacement license. Claiming he'd withdrawn almost all his money from his bank accounts. He was preparing to disappear. On September 24th, a woman on a beach in Galveston County, Texas, recognized Jesse Matthew from news reports. She called authorities. Police found him sleeping on a remote stretch of beach. He was arrested without incident. The FBI and local police held a joint press conference. Matthew was extradited back to Virginia, where he was booked into jail, but Hannah was still missing. The community held out hope, but with each passing day, that hope dimmed. On October 18, 2014, 5 weeks after Hannah Graham had last been seen, a search team from the Chesterfield County Sheriff's Office made a grim discovery. They were searching a rural area in southern Albemarle County along Old Lynchburg Road, about 12 miles southwest of downtown Charlottesville. Behind a vacant property, they found skeletal remains. Chief Longo held a press conference that day. The remains hadn't been positively identified yet, he said, but Hannah's parents had been notified of the discovery. Everyone knew. Everyone understood what this meant. The remains were sent to the chief medical examiner's office in Richmond. On October 24th, the identification was confirmed. It was Hannah Graham. Found with her remains were the clothes she'd been wearing that night. The black crop top, unzipped and turned inside out. Her jeans also inside out, with holes that hadn't been there before. Her watch was nearby, but her undergarments, her shoes, and her cell phone were never recovered. The medical examiner determined that Hannah's death was the result of homicidal violence. Based on the lack of significant trauma to her skull, she'd likely been killed by suffocation or strangulation. Jesse Matthews' car had been seen between 6:30 and 7:30 on the morning of September 13th, near the rural property where Hannah's remains were found. DNA that was likely Hannah's was discovered on Matthews' shorts and on the interior passenger side door of his car. The evidence was overwhelming. On February 2nd, 2015, nearly 5 months after Hannah disappeared, Jesse Matthew was indicted for first-degree murder in addition to the abduction charges. But the investigation was far from over. Remember the DNA evidence from that 2005 sexual assault in Fairfax? The one that had gone cold for nearly a decade. Detective Michael Boone had never stopped working that case. When Jesse Matthew was arrested in Hannah Graham's disappearance, Detective Boone was watching the news coverage. He saw the surveillance video of Hannah walking through the downtown mall. Something clicked. He requested that Matthew's DNA be compared to the DNA from his unsolved case. It was a match. Jesse Matthew was the man who had attacked the woman in Fairfax in 2005. He was charged with attempted murder, abduction, and sexual assault. In June of 2015, Matthew entered an Alford plea, a legal maneuver where he didn't admit guilt but acknowledged there was enough evidence to convict him. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, but investigators weren't done. They compared Matthew's DNA to evidence from another case, the Morgan Dana Harrington case from 2009. On September 29th, 2014, authorities announced that forensic evidence had linked Jesse Matthew to Morgan Harrington's murder. Sources said Matthew had been driving his cab the night Morgan disappeared from the Metallica concert. Forensic evidence from Morgan's Pantera t-shirt matched Matthew's DNA. Morgan's parents, who had feared for 5 years that their daughter's killer would never be found, finally had answers. Finally had a name. Jill Harrington would later call Jesse Matthew a serial rapist and murderer who had been hiding in plain sight in Charlottesville for years. On September 15th, 2015, Jesse Matthew was formally charged with first-degree murder and abduction with intent to defile in Morgan Harrington's death. The cases of Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington, separated by 5 years, were connected. Both young women had been in Charlottesville. Both had been vulnerable. Both had encountered Jesse Matthew. Both had died. Jesse Matthew had a decision to make. He could go to trial, face a jury, risk the death penalty, or he could plead guilty and accept life in prison. On March 2nd, 2016, Jesse Matthew stood in a courtroom in Albemarle County. He was asked to enter his plea. Guilty to first-degree murder of Hannah Graham, he said softly. Guilty of abduction and intent to defile of Hannah Graham. Guilty to the first-degree murder of Morgan Harrington. Guilty of abduction with the intent to defile Morgan Harrington. 4 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. No geriatric release. He gave up his right to appeal. Matthew showed no emotion in court. He didn't speak directly to the families. His attorney said Matthew was terribly sorry for everything that had happened. In the courtroom were 2 sets of parents who would never see their daughters again, John and Susan Graham. And Jill and Dan Harrington. They'd waited for this moment. For justice. For acknowledgement of what had been taken from them. Susan Graham, Hannah's mother, read a victim impact statement. She called her daughter a heroine. She helped capture a serial rapist and murderer who had been hiding in plain sight in Charlottesville for years, she said. Hannah had been 18 years old. She'd had her whole life ahead of her. Instead, her death had helped ensure that Jesse Matthew would never harm another woman. Morgan had been 20. She'd been a Virginia Tech student with dreams and ambitions. Her death, too, had finally been answered with justice. Jesse Matthew was sent to Red Onion State Prison in Virginia, where he remains to this day. Combined with his sentence from the Fairfax case, he is serving 7 consecutive life sentences. In May of 2019, it was reported that Matthew had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. He was transferred to another facility for treatment. Both the Harrington and Graham families were notified. The murder of Hannah Graham changed things. The University of Virginia implemented new safety measures, more police patrols, more emergency phones, more lighting, enhanced escort services for students walking at night. The case highlighted how serial predators can evade detection, moving from school to school, from town to town. Jesse Matthew had been accused twice of sexual assault in college, but no charges had been filed. He'd been allowed to walk away, and because of that, he was free to assault a woman in Fairfax in 2005, free to kill Morgan Harrington in 2009, free to kill Hannah Graham in 2014. A memorial was erected at UVA in Hannah's honor. The World Bank, where her father worked, established an annual award for innovations to reduce gender-based violence, held in Hannah's memory. A scholarship was set up in 2021, honoring her participation in softball. Hannah's legacy became larger than her death. She became a symbol of the need for better protections, better reporting, better action. And young women come forward with allegations of assault. Jill Harrington, Morgan's mother, has continued her advocacy work, speaking about the connections between sexual assault, serial predators, and murder. She's pushed for better communication between law enforcement agencies, for DNA databases, for taking accusations seriously. The families of Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington, connected by tragedy, have found common ground in their grief and their determination to prevent other families from experiencing what they've experienced. Hannah Elizabeth Graham was born in February of 1996 and died in September of 2014. She lived for 18 years, such a short time. But in that time, she made an impact. She was the kind of person who spent her spring break rebuilding houses for people she'd never met. The kind of daughter who kept a stuffed bunny as her guardian angel. The kind of student who earned straight A's while also being kind to everyone around her. Her father said she loved helping people. Her friends said she was intelligent, warm, genuine. She had freckles and blue eyes and a smile that people remembered. On September 13th, 2014, Hannah Graham went to a party. She got separated from her friends. She became disoriented, and she encountered someone who saw her vulnerability, not as something requiring help, but as an opportunity. What happened to Hannah could have happened to anyone. Any young woman, any college student, any person who found themselves alone, vulnerable and in the path of someone who meant them harm. That's what makes this story so haunting. It's not about a girl who made bad choices. It's about a girl who was targeted by a predator, who had learned to identify vulnerability and exploit it, who had done it before and gotten away with it, who would likely have done it again if Hannah's death hadn't led investigators to finally connect the dots. Hannah Graham's story is a tragedy, but it's also a story about a community that came together, about volunteers who searched, about investigators who wouldn't give up, about families who turned their grief into advocacy, about a young woman whose death helped ensure that her killer would never harm anyone else. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that even in the darkest stories, there can be light. The light of people who care, who search, who fight for justice, who remember. Rest now. Let the details of this story fade gently as you settle into sleep. Hannah Graham is remembered. Morgan Harrington is remembered. Their lives mattered. Their stories matter. And somewhere in Virginia, on a university campus that was forever changed by loss, students walk past a memorial. They may not have known Hannah Graham personally, but they know her name. They know she was here. They know she mattered. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.